Mournfield, Episode 4, The Voss Farmhouse, a Mr. Ripper's original. The following is a work of fiction. The Mournfield series is produced by Ripper's Nighttime Tales. What follows takes place in 1962, in a Vermont that still believed in endurance as a virtue, in silence as a form of strength, in the idea that grief was a private matter between a person and God, and nobody else's business. The Hollow understood this perfectly. It had been waiting for exactly this kind of family.
There is a generation of Americans who survive things they never talked about. You know them, you grew up with them, or beside them, or in the long shadow they cast the grandparents and great-uncles and aging neighbors who had a particular quality of stillness, a particular economy of emotion, a way of looking at the middle distance sometimes that told you without words that they had filed something very large in a place they had no intention of reopening. They called it strength. They called it moving on. They called it you do what you have to do and you don't make a production of it. What they were doing, most of them, was surviving. In the only way they knew how, in the way their fathers had survived, and their fathers' fathers, by compression, by containment, by building the wall high enough and thick enough and hoping it held. The walls held for a lot of them. For Harold Voss, the wall held for 11 years. 11 years of chosen, in a box, in the back of his mind. 11 years of names, Harkness, DeVito, Coletti, Lee, that he said to no one, heard in no context, allowed to exist only in the sealed and labeled drawer where he had put them in the winter of 1951 when he came home with all his fingers and most of his hearing and the specific 1,000-yard stare of a man who has been somewhere that doesn't have adequate language. 11 years of holding. Then a construction crew broke ground on a new road outside Delworth, Vermont, in the spring of 1962. And they unearthed a box that Caleb Hurst had buried in 1947, and what was inside the box was not interested in walls. It was interested in cracks. Harold Voss had a crack. He'd had it since Korea. He just didn't know it was showing. My name is Mr. Rippers. This is episode 4 of Mournfield, The Voss Farmhouse. This is the story of a family that almost didn't make it. Almost is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence. Pay attention to Carol. Part 1. The farmhouse. The Voss farm sat on 40 acres outside Delworth, Vermont, which in 1962 was the kind of town that appeared on maps with the specific reluctance of a place that has never needed to be found by anyone who didn't already know where it was. Population: 1,100, if you counted generously and included the outlying farms. One general store. One church Congregationalist, white clapboard, attended with the regular but not fervent commitment of people who believed in God in the same way they believed in hard winters, as a fact of life that required preparation rather than enthusiasm. One elementary school that fed into the regional high school 12 miles away. A diner. A gas station. The specific self-sufficiency of a community that had been doing without outside assistance long enough to have stopped noticing it was doing without. Harold Voss had grown up on the farm. His father had grown up on it. The farmhouse had been built in 1891 and had the architectural personality of something that had decided long ago to stop negotiating with Vermont winters and had simply dug in, low-ceilinged, thick-walled, heated by 2 wood stoves that Harold maintained with the same wordless competence he applied to everything mechanical. The kind of house that smelled like wood smoke and old wood, and the specific accumulated warmth of generations of the same family eating in the same kitchen. Harold was 53 years old in 1962. He farmed dairy, primarily, 60 head of Holsteins that he managed with a hired hand named Earl Fossey, who had worked the farm since 1955 and communicated with Harold in the efficient shorthand of 2 men who have no need for words they haven't already established the meaning of. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who have done physical work their whole lives, with hands that looked like they'd been made for a larger person and eyes that looked like they'd been somewhere the rest of him was trying to forget. His wife Edna was 51. She was the warmth in the house, the way Dana Harper was the warmth in the Harper house 22 years later, the way warm women are always the warmth in houses where the men have been built for endurance rather than expression. She baked. She kept a garden that in summer produced more tomatoes than 2 people, and one farmhand could reasonably consume. She was active in the church, in the community, in the network of neighboring farm families that constituted the social fabric of Delworth, visiting, organizing, contributing to the collective life of a place that ran on mutual assistance because it had always run on mutual assistance. She was also, in the spring of 1962, quietly worried about her husband in a way she had no language for and no one to say it to. He'd always been the way he was, quiet, contained, efficient in his love, present without being demonstrative, reliable without being warm in the way she was warm. She'd known this when she married him. She'd chosen it, in the way that women of her generation and background sometimes chose the steady, silent man over the expressive one, trusting steadiness over expression as the more durable quality. What she hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't have known in 1953 when she married him, 2 years after he came home from Korea, was that the steadiness and the silence were the same thing, that what she'd taken for calm was containment, that what she'd taken for peace was the daily, unremarked work of keeping a very large thing very firmly in a very secure box. She didn't know about the box. Harold had never told her about Korea in any detail. She knew he'd been there. She knew winter 1950 had been, she had a word for it, hard, which was the word her generation used for things that were actually unspeakable. And she knew he'd come home changed in ways that had become, over 9 years of marriage, simply the texture of who he was. She accepted this. She loved him inside it. She built a life with him that worked, genuinely worked, in the specific modest way of two people who have found a livable equilibrium and are grateful for it. Their son Thomas had been killed in Korea in the same winter that Harold had survived it, 1950. Thomas Voss, 22 years old, first tour, dead, at the Chosin Reservoir. Harold had been there. Harold had not told Edna this for 11 years. He had told her only that Thomas had been killed in action, which she had known, which everyone had known. The telegram had come in February 1951, 3 weeks before Harold came home. Harold had been less than 200 yards from his son when Thomas died. He had not reached him in time. This was the crack. The wall he had built was built specifically around the crack. It had held for 11 years. Their daughter Carol was 26 in 1962. She had married at 22, moved to Burlington, discovered within 3 years that the man she'd married was not the man she'd imagined she was marrying, and had come home 6 months ago, quietly, without making a production of it, in the Voss tradition, to take stock and figure out what came next. She was not unhappy to be home. She loved the farm, loved her parents, loved the specific rhythm of the farmhouse life she'd grown up in. She was taking stock the way a sensible person takes stock, honestly, without drama, with the particular clarity of someone who has made a mistake and is not interested in compounding it with self-pity. She was the one who noticed things first. She always had been. Part 2. What was unearthed? The construction crew was building a new county road in April 1962, a project that had been in planning for 3 years and had finally received the funding and the municipal will to proceed. The road would run along the eastern edge of the old Hearst property, which had been abandoned since the 1950s, when the last of the Hearst family sold the land to the county and moved to Massachusetts. Caleb Hearst had been the minister in Delworth. He'd buried the box on his own property in 1947, with the specific intention that it stay buried, that the land around it remain undisturbed, that whatever was inside it remain in the dark for as long as possible. He hadn't accounted for county road projects. A construction worker named Bobby Tullis hit the box with his shovel at approximately 11 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. He was 20 years old, curious in the way that 20-year-olds are curious about things they dig up, and he pulled the box out and opened it without hesitation, because it was 1962, and the concept of leaving things buried because they might be better buried was not part of his worldview. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had survived 15 years in Vermont soil with surprising integrity, a porcelain doll. Dark hair. A face that was, Bobby thought, very well made for something that had been in the ground for what looked like at least a decade. The features were clear and precise, the eyes were open. He stood in the mud with the doll in his hands and looked at it. He didn't feel anything unusual. Bobby Tullis was 20 years old with no meaningful grief, no dead he was missing, no crack in any wall. The hollow, freshly unearthed after 15 years of genuine dormancy, was depleted, functioning below the level required to affect someone with no vulnerability to exploit. He put it in the truck, thinking vaguely that his girlfriend might like it, or that it might be worth something. His girlfriend did not like it. She said, without being able to explain why, that it gave her a bad feeling and she didn't want it in the apartment. Bobby, who had no strong feelings about it either way, took it to the antique shop on Delworth's Main Street the following Saturday. The shop was run by a woman named Margaret Fenn, who had been buying and selling other people's histories for 20 years and had a good eye for quality. She looked at the doll for a long time before she offered Bobby $7 for it, which he accepted. She put it on the shelf at the back of the shop, in the section she reserved for items that needed research before she could price them properly. She planned to look into the craftsmanship. The construction was unusual, the materials were high quality, there was clearly a story here. She never got to the research. Edna Voss came into the shop on a Thursday, 3 days after Bobby Tullis sold it, looking for a birthday gift for her neighbor's daughter. She was not in the market for a doll. She was in the market for something practical. Kitchen goods, perhaps, or a nice piece of fabric. She saw the doll on the back shelf and stopped. It was the expression that caught her. The specific quality of the smile. Not the smile itself, which was ordinary enough, but the patience in it. The sense of something waiting with an acceptance of the wait that went beyond the inanimate. She stood at the back of Margaret Fenn's shop and looked at the doll and thought about Thomas. She hadn't thought about Thomas and she couldn't remember how long. Not in the active, present tense way she was thinking about him now. He'd been dead for 11 years. She'd grieved him, or done what she understood as grieving him, in the way of 1951, the black clothes, the church, the casseroles from neighbors, the particular structure of public mourning that told you when to begin and when to end, and was designed, she understood in retrospect, more for the community's comfort than the family's. She and Harold had never talked about Thomas. Not properly. Not the way that people talk about someone they've lost when they're trying to survive the loss together. They'd talked around him. They'd mentioned him in the past tense, in passing. In the careful way of two people who have agreed without discussion that the subject is too large and too dangerous to approach directly. Standing at the back of Margaret Fenn's shop, looking at a porcelain doll on a shelf, Edna Voss felt the grief she hadn't fully felt in 11 years, move through her, like a tide coming in. She bought the doll for $3 and brought it home. Part 3. What Carol noticed the doll the evening her mother brought it home. She was in the kitchen when Edna came through the door, unwrapping the doll from the paper bag Margaret Fenn had put it in, her face carrying an expression Carol recognized from childhood as the expression her mother wore when she had done something she considered a small indulgence, slightly defensive, slightly pleased, slightly prepared for someone to tell her it was unnecessary. "What's that?" Carol asked. "Isn't it lovely?" Edna set it on the kitchen table and stepped back. "I found it at Margaret's. I thought it would look nice in the sitting room." Carol looked at the doll. She was a perceptive person, had always been, in the way of people who grow up in quiet households and develop the habit of reading small signals because the large ones are rarely offered. She looked at the doll and felt something she would spend months trying to name accurately, and would eventually settle on wrongly attentive, the sense of an object that was oriented toward the room in a way that objects were not supposed to be oriented. "It's very well made," she said carefully. "That's what I thought." Edna picked it up and carried it to the sitting room, where she placed it on the shelf above the fireplace. The shelf that held family photographs, including the one of Thomas in his army uniform taken 3 months before he shipped out. The doll went on the shelf next to Thomas's photograph. Carol stood in the sitting room doorway and looked at this arrangement, and felt the wrongly attentive quality intensify in a way she couldn't account for and didn't entirely trust. She said nothing. There was nothing she could say. It was a doll on a shelf. Her mother had bought it and was pleased with it. And the expression on Edna's face when she stood back and looked at the sitting room. Something loosened. Something that had been held tightly for a long time releasing by a fraction. Was not an expression Carol was willing to disturb without better reason than a feeling she couldn't name. She went back to the kitchen and finished making dinner and told herself she was imagining things. She was not imagining things. She knew this by the end of the first week. Her mother had always been a sound sleeper, one of those people who goes out completely, a switch-click departure from consciousness that Carol had envied her whole childhood. In the first week after the doll arrived, Edna started waking in the night. Carol heard her, the creak of the bedroom floor, the soft footsteps down the hall, the quiet of the sitting room below. She went to check on the second night. Her mother was sitting in the armchair in the sitting room, the doll in her lap, in the lamplight. Her eyes were open. She was murmuring something Carol couldn't make out from the doorway. Low and rhythmic. The cadence of prayer or of a conversation being conducted very quietly out of consideration for others who might be sleeping. "Mom," Carol said softly. Edna looked up, focused. A slight confusion, the kind that attends sudden awakening, and then clarity. "Carol, I'm sorry. Did I wake you? I heard you up. Are you all right?" "I was just sitting." Carol came into the room, sat on the sofa across from her mother, looked at the doll, at its face, its arranged features, its patient expression in the lamplight. "What were you saying?" Carol asked. "Just now, when I came in." A pause. "Was I talking?" It sounded like it. Edna was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about Thomas," she said. "I suppose I was thinking out loud." Carol looked at her mother's face, at the quality of her eyes in the lamplight, clear, present, but with something underneath that Carol recognized as the specific emotional rawness of someone who has been crying for a long time or is very close to it. "We never talk about him," Carol said carefully. "No." Edna smoothed the doll's dress with one hand. "We never do. Do you want to?" A long silence. Outside, the Vermont night. April. Still cold. The specific quiet of a farm after dark when the animals are settled and the machinery is still. "I don't know how," Edna said finally. "Your father and I, we never learned how. And then so much time passed. It seemed like disturbing something. Like opening a window in a room that's been sealed." "It's already open," Carol said. Her mother looked at her. "Whatever you were just doing, that's the window open." Sitting up at night talking to Carol stopped, looked at the doll, looked back at her mother. "Whoever you were talking to." Edna's hands stilled on the doll's dress. They sat in the lamplight for a long time without speaking, and Carol thought about what she'd almost said, talking to the doll, and the way the sentence had rerouted itself at the last moment. Because saying it out loud would make it concrete, and she wasn't ready for it to be concrete yet. She needed more time, more observation, more of the careful, patient watching that she'd been doing her whole life in this quiet house. She went back to bed. In the morning, her father was at the kitchen table earlier than usual, a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking in front of him, looking at the wall. He looked up when Carol came downstairs. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Fine." She poured her own coffee. Sat across from him. "You? Well enough." This was Harold Voss's standard answer for everything that had ever happened to him. Well enough. It covered the full range from genuinely fine to the worst night of my life without distinguishing between them, which was, Carol had come to understand, entirely intentional. She looked at her father and thought about cracks in walls. "Dad," she said, Mom bought a doll yesterday. I saw, she was up with it last night, sitting in the sitting room." Harold drank his coffee, said nothing. "Does that seem," Carol searched for the right word, "normal to you?" A long pause. "Your mother grieves in her own way. She's had it for a week. Thomas would have been 33 this year." Harold set his cup down. His voice was completely flat, the way it was completely flat when he was working to keep it that way. "She grieves in her own way." He stood up, put his cup in the sink, went out to the barn. Carol sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at the door he'd gone through and thought about the way he'd said Thomas's name. The specific care of it, the way you say a word you don't say often, the way it had cost him something to say it that showed in the flatness he'd used to cover the cost. She thought about the sitting room, about the shelf above the fireplace, about Thomas's photograph and the doll placed next to it. She went to the sitting room and stood in front of the shelf. In the morning light, the doll looked different than it had the night before. Or not different, clearer, the features more precise, the expression more defined. She had the irrational thought, and she flagged it as irrational, immediately in the way of a sensible person encountering something that doesn't fit, that the doll looked more present than it had yesterday, more inhabited. She looked at Thomas's photograph, at his young face, the army uniform, the expression of a 22-year-old who does not yet know what is coming. The doll's eyes, she noticed, were aimed at the photograph. She reached out and turned the doll so it faced the room instead of the photograph. She went back to the kitchen. She started making breakfast. When she came back through the sitting room 20 minutes later to call her parents to the table, the doll was facing the photograph again. Part 4. Harold Voss began dreaming in May. He did not tell anyone this. He would not have told anyone this if you had asked him directly, because Harold Voss did not discuss his interior life with anyone, not with Edna, not with Carol, not with Earl Fossey, not with the doctor he saw annually in town who had been trying for 4 years to get him to discuss what the doctor carefully called the stress response and Harold called, "I'm fine." He dreamed about Chosin. Not the way combat veterans are supposed to dream about it. Not the nightmares, not the waking in a cold sweat, not the vivid reliving of the worst moments. Those dreams would have been manageable, in their way. He knew how to manage the worst moments. He had filed them. He had labeled the box and put it on a high shelf, and not looked at it for 11 years. These dreams were different. In these dreams he was at Chosin, but nothing was happening. He was simply there, in the cold, in the particular quality of Korean winter dark, the stars above the reservoir hard and clear in the way of stars at altitude in cold air, and the men were with him. Harkness, DeVito, Coletti, Lee, Thomas. Standing next to him in the dark, 22 years old, in his uniform whole and uninjured, and looking at his father with an expression Harold had not seen on his son's face since Thomas was a boy, the expression of someone who wants to say something and doesn't know how to start. Harold stood in the dream beside his son, and the cold was the specific remembered cold of the Chosin Reservoir in November 1950, and Thomas was 22 years old and alive, and Harold was unable to move, unable to speak, aware on some level that this was a dream, and aware on a deeper level that it did not matter, that this was more real than most of what he experienced awake. Thomas opened his mouth. Harold woke up. Every night for 3 weeks the dream went the same way. Thomas on the verge of speaking, Harold waking before the words came. He lay in the dark after each waking and felt the dream recede, and felt, when it was gone, a loss that was almost physical, the specific bereft quality of someone who has been close to something they needed, and had it taken away again. He started going to bed earlier, trying to get back to the dream faster. This is a thing he would have been deeply ashamed of if he'd been able to examine it clearly, and the fact that he couldn't examine it clearly was itself a symptom, though he had no framework for recognizing it as such. He started sitting with the doll. Not consciously, not deliberately, not in the way Edna sat with it, the organized nightly conversations, the deliberate intimacy. Harold would find himself in the sitting room in the evenings, after Edna and Carol had gone to bed, simply present in the room. Not talking, not doing anything in particular, just in the room, in the chair nearest the shelf, in the proximity of the doll and Thomas's photograph. He told himself he was thinking. He was being fed. Carol found him there on the third night. She had come downstairs for water and seen the sitting room light, and pushed the door open quietly. Her father was in the armchair, hands on his knees, looking at the shelf. He turned when she came in, fully alert, not the confused waking of her mother on the first night. He'd been awake. Dad. Carol. He didn't seem embarrassed. He seemed distant. The 1,000-yard stare quality he carried normally had deepened into something more present and more absent simultaneously, if that's possible to imagine. More present in the sitting room, more absent from everything outside it. "It's late," she said. "I know." She looked at the shelf, at the doll, at Thomas's photograph beside it. "You're dreaming about him," she said, not a question. A long pause. Harold looked at her. "Yes, since the doll came." Another pause. "I don't see what that has to do with it." "It moves," she said, "on its own. I've repositioned it 3 times, and each time it's back facing the photograph before I come back in the room. Mom is up with it every night, you are sitting with it every night, and you're both dreaming about Thomas, which neither of you dreamed about for 11 years before that thing came into this house." Harold said nothing. "I know you don't want to hear this," Carol said. "I know that it sounds—" She stopped. There was no word that was going to make this sound reasonable to a 53-year-old Vermont dairy farmer in 1962. "I know how it sounds. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that I'm right. And if you are, then we get rid of it." "Your mother?" "I know." Carol sat down on the sofa. She looked at her father, at the hands that were too big for the rest of him, flat on his knees, at the eyes that had been somewhere she couldn't follow. "I know it's helping her. I know that taking it away will be hard. But Dad, what it's giving her is not Thomas. It's not a connection to Thomas. It's something that's learned how to sound like Thomas using everything she's given it. It's not the same thing." Harold was quiet for a long time. The sitting room held its specific nighttime stillness, the wood stove ticking, the house settling, the April wind outside pushing against the thick walls and not getting in. "In the dreams," he said finally. His voice was very low. "He's about to say something. Every night. He's about to say something and I wake up before he does." Carol waited. "I need to know what he's going to say." Harold's voice, controlled for 53 years, cracked on the last word in a way that was very small and very complete. 11 years and I've never let myself. "I know," Carol said. "I was there," he said. "I've never told your mother. I was there when he stopped." The wall was very close to failing. She could see it. She had never seen it this close to failing in her entire life. "I was 200 yards away. I couldn't get to him." The room was very quiet. "That is not something you should have carried alone for 11 years, Carol said carefully. "No." He looked at his hands. "No, I don't suppose it is." From the shelf, the doll sat in the lamplight and watched them both with its painted, patient eyes, and did what it always did when families began to crack open. It waited, and it took notes, and it prepared to offer, at the right moment, the thing that would make the crack a door. Carol looked at the doll. The doll looked back. "Not tonight," she said, to the doll specifically, in a tone she had not planned to use and did not entirely understand but felt was necessary. "You don't get this tonight." Her father looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Go to bed, Dad," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow. We'll talk properly." He went to bed. She sat in the sitting room alone with the doll for a long time. Part 5. Edna. What the Hollow was doing to Edna Voss was, in its way, the most complete work it had done since the Mournfield Circle. The most patient, the most carefully calibrated to the specific architecture of its subject. Edna Voss was a woman who had been grieving Thomas for 11 years in the wrong way. Not inadequately, not without depth or feeling, but in isolation, in the sealed room way of a marriage between two people who had agreed without discussion that the room stayed sealed. She had grieved Thomas in the Methodist tradition, the structure of public mourning, the casseroles, the church, and then she had put it away because that was what you did, and she had lived alongside the sealed room for 11 years, aware of it the way you're aware of a door in a hallway you never open. The doll opened the door, and what came out was 11 years of compressed grief that had been looking for somewhere to go. The Hollow had found the perfect vessel for it. Not the porcelain doll. Edna herself. She had become, over 6 weeks of nightly conversations, a container for grief so pure and so available that the Hollow barely needed to manufacture anything. It just held the space. Let the grief pour in. Fed on it with the specific pleasure of something encountering, after months of managed rations and depleted sources, a supply that was deep and fresh and given freely. Edna talked to it about Thomas every night. His childhood. His voice. The way he'd been afraid of storms as a boy and had come into their room at night, and Harold had carried him back without complaint, wordlessly, 3 times in a single summer. The way he'd learned to drive the tractor at 12 and had been so proud of it. The summer before he enlisted, when he'd seemed older, somehow, in a way that scared her in retrospect, as though some part of him had known. The Hollow took all of it, stored all of it, and began, in the 4th week, to give some of it back. In voices, not Thomas's voice, not yet, not precisely, something approximate, something that answered her questions in the pauses with sounds that had the shape of his speech without quite having the substance. Close enough, in the lamplight at midnight, for a woman who needed it to be close enough. Edna Voss had not been a credulous woman. She had been a practical woman, a sensible woman, a woman who had lived in the physical world of farms and seasons and concrete work for 51 years and had a natural skepticism about things that couldn't be touched or measured. What the Hollow offered was something she could touch. She held it every night. She could feel the warmth of it. She could feel it answer. She stopped questioning what it was and started accepting what it gave her, and the acceptance deepened the access, and the access deepened the feed. And the Hollow grew stronger in the Voss farmhouse in 6 weeks than it had grown in 6 months with Gerald Aldrich, because Edna's grief was real and fresh in the way that long compressed grief is fresh when it first releases, and it was given without reservation, without the hedging of a man who assesses risk for a living, without the sensible caution of a hospital administrator who has read the relevant documentation. It was given the way a drowning person gives themselves to the thing they think is saving them. Carol watched this escalation with the specific helplessness of someone who can see exactly what is happening and cannot find a lever to stop it. She tried twice to talk to her mother about the doll, in the careful way she'd been taught. The way you talk to someone about something they don't want to hear in a family that has made not hearing a structural feature. Both times Edna had received the conversation with the pleasant, impenetrable serenity of someone whose access to a comforting unreality has made ordinary reality feel thin and unnecessary. "I just think it's been good for me," Edna said the second time, with a smile that was entirely her own and entirely wrong. "I feel better than I have in years. Don't you want me to feel better?" Carol looked at her mother's face. At the eyes, clear, warm, genuinely her mother's eyes, and at the something behind them that was not quite Edna Voss in the way Edna Voss had always been Edna Voss. Not replaced, not consumed, not yet, thinning. "Yes," Carol said. "I want you to feel better." She went to find her father. Part 6. The Thing in the Barn. Harold had started going to the barn at night. Carol discovered this in the third week of May, when she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of the barn door and looked out her window to see her father crossing the yard in the moonlight, moving with the deliberateness of a man who knows exactly where he's going. She watched from the window for 20 minutes. He didn't come back. She went down. She crossed the yard in the cool May night, the grass wet with dew, the barn smell reaching her before she got to the door, hay and cattle, and the warm, dense animal dark that she'd grown up with and found. Tonight less comforting than usual. She found her father in the far stall. Not with the animals. The far stall, at the back of the barn, was used for equipment storage, old tools, spare parts, the accumulated hardware of 50 years of farm work. Her father was standing in the center of it, in the dark, in his work boots and pajamas, facing the wall. His hands were at his sides. His posture had the quality she'd been seeing in the sitting room, deep in the present-absent combination, the sense of a man who was physically in one place and mentally in another. But here, without the lamp, without the familiar surroundings of the sitting room, it was starker, more alarming. The specific wrongness of a person occupying a space that they are not, in any meaningful sense, occupying. "Dad." She touched his arm. He came back slowly. The eyes traveled back from wherever they'd been and found her, and the distance receded, and what was left was Harold Voss at 53, tired in a way that went below tired, the exhaustion of someone whose sleep has been doing something other than restoring him. "Carol." He looked at the barn around him, as though noting it. "I was in bed." "I know. I saw you come out." She kept her hand on his arm. "This isn't the first time, is it?" A pause. "No." "How long?" 2 weeks. He looked at his hands. "I come to myself out here. I don't know what I do between going to sleep and coming to myself." 2 weeks and you didn't say anything." "I thought..." He stopped. "I thought it would pass." Carol looked at the far wall of the barn, the blank weathered wood that her father had been facing when she found him. There was nothing there, nothing distinguishing, just wall. "What's in that direction?" she asked. Her father looked at the wall. Something moved across his face. "The Hearst property," he said, "where the box had been buried, where the construction crew had unearthed it in April, where Caleb Hearst had put the hollow in the ground in 1947 and prayed, with the specific desperate sincerity of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why it was necessary, that it would stay there. 200 yards, roughly. "Okay," Carol said. "That's enough. We're done." "Carol, we are done." Her voice was quiet, but it was not a voice that was open to negotiation. It was, Harold thought, with the portion of him that was still functioning clearly, the voice of a woman who has decided something and is not going to be managed out of it. "I don't know exactly what that thing is, and I don't care. I know what it's doing to this family. I know you're walking to the barn in your sleep and pointing yourself at the place it came from. I know Mom is up every night talking to it and getting back answers that can't be real. I know we're all dreaming about Thomas in a way we didn't before April." She looked at her father steadily. "And I know that what it's doing is not helping us. It's feeding on us. There is a difference." Harold looked at his daughter. At the face that was, he thought, had always thought, though he'd never said it, the most like Thomas's. Same jaw. Same way of looking at a problem directly and not flinching. "Your mother," he said. "I'll talk to her. She won't want to. I know." "Taking it away, Dad." Carol's voice was steady. "Whatever it's been giving her, it isn't Thomas. It learned to sound like Thomas from the things she told it. That's not the same. You know it's not the same. Harold was quiet for a long moment. The barn held them, the cattle breathing in their stalls, the smell of hay, the May night outside, the specific small sounds of a living farm that had been living since 1891 and had held this family inside it through things it had never been equipped to understand. "All right," Harold said. They walked back to the house together through the wet grass. At the door, Harold stopped and looked out at the dark, in the direction of the Hearst property. And Carol watched him look, and watched whatever had been pulling him in that direction for 2 weeks. Watched him feel it, and register it, and square his shoulders against it. He went inside. Part 7. What Carol did, she did not do it alone. This is the thing she insisted on. In the account she gave to no one, the account she held in her own mind for the rest of her life, private and complete, the story she told herself about the summer of 1962 when she figured out that some things cannot be fought alone and that asking for help is not weakness but is, in fact, the only strategy that works. She asked her father. She asked him the next morning, at breakfast, in the kitchen, while her mother was still upstairs. She told him what she needed him to do, and she explained why, drawing on everything she'd observed over 6 weeks with the clarity of a woman who has been paying very close attention. She told him about the crack in the wall and the way the hollow had found the crack, and widened it, and was using it as a door. Harold listened. He did not interrupt. He drank his coffee and listened in the way he listened to things that cost him something to hear, with complete stillness, which was his version of complete attention. When she finished, he said, "All right. It's going to be hard," Carol said. "What I need you to do. It's going to be the hardest thing. I know. Harder than Korea." He looked at her. "Nothing is harder than Korea. This is the part Korea left behind," she said. "I think that might be the same thing." They got Edna to the kitchen on a pretense. Carol made her mother's favorite breakfast, the specific French toast with cinnamon that Edna had made for Carol's childhood Sunday mornings, and that Carol had replicated imperfectly ever since, and that Edna could not resist commenting on and improving. They got her to the kitchen table with coffee and French toast, and the slight distraction of a task, "Show me again how you do the custard." And by the time the doll's absence registered, it was too late for Edna to go back to the sitting room before Carol sat down beside her and took her hands. "Mom," she said, "I need you to listen to me." Edna looked at her. The pleasant, impenetrable serenity was there, but underneath it, because Carol was her daughter, and daughters know the things mothers carry, something that was not serene. Something that had been trying to get through the serenity for weeks, and hadn't found a gap. "That doll is not Thomas," Carol said. "It is not a connection to Thomas. It learned to sound like Thomas from everything you told it, and I know that what it gave you felt real. I know it felt like something you needed, and I know you needed something, Mom. I know. 11 years is a long time to need something and not have it." Her voice was steady. Her hands were tight around her mother's. "But the thing that can actually give you what you need is sitting right here, and it's been here the whole time." Edna looked at her daughter. The serenity cracked, not dramatically, not all at once, a fracture line running through it. Harold cleared his throat. Both women looked at him. He was sitting across the table. His hands were flat on the wood, the way they'd been flat on the desk and on the chair arm in the barn, but differently now. Not the stillness of suspension, the stillness of choice. "I was there," he said. Edna went very still. "When Thomas died, I was 200 yards away." The words came out at the same pace as everything Harold Voss had ever said, measured, deliberate, each one placed carefully, but the flatness was gone. What was underneath was enormous, and old, and finally being let out of the box. "I've been carrying that for 11 years, I should have told you, I didn't know how." Edna's hand, in Carol's, tightened. "He wasn't alone," Harold said. "I want you to know that. He wasn't alone. There were men with him. He wasn't—" His voice did what it had almost done in the sitting room, what it had been held back from for 11 years. He wasn't alone. Edna Voss put her hand over her mouth. And then, in the kitchen of the farmhouse that had held this family since 1891, with the French toast going cold on the plates and the morning coming through the window in the particular quality of Vermont May light, warm and clear and uncompromising, Edna and Harold Voss finally talked about their son. Carol sat with them. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. She held her mother's hand and listened to her father dismantle, piece by piece, the wall he'd been building since 1951. And she understood that this specific, costly, irreplaceable thing was what the Hollow had been trying to replace, not Thomas. The conversation that his absence required, the breaking open that grief demands eventually, in one form or another, through one door or another. The Hollow had offered a door that looked easier, that asked nothing, took everything, and left you more alone than before in a room you couldn't find your way out of. Carol had found the other door. It was harder. It asked everything. It gave back something real. Part 8: The Doll Alone. Carol had taken the doll from the sitting room shelf before breakfast. She'd wrapped it in an old flour sack and put it in the woodshed, which was the furthest outbuilding from the house, and latched the door. She went to check on it at noon. The door was latched. She unlatched it. Went inside. The flour sack was on the floor, open. The doll was sitting on the old splitting block in the center of the shed. Upright. Facing the door. Facing her. Carol stood in the doorway of the woodshed in the May noon light and looked at the doll and felt, very clearly, the thing she'd been feeling since the first evening Edna had put it on the shelf. The wrongly attentive quality. The weight of being assessed by something that had been assessing her family for 6 weeks and had found her, specifically, to be the obstacle. "They're talking," she said. "Right now. In the kitchen. They're talking about Thomas, actually talking, not to you, not to a substitute, to each other." She kept her voice level. "You can feel that, can't you? You can feel what you're not getting." The doll sat on the splitting block. "You're not going to get it," Carol said. "Not from them, not from me. We don't have anything for you." The temperature in the woodshed dropped. She felt it, the specific cold she'd heard, later, that Paul Greer had described. 2 degrees, 3. The cold of something expressing a reaction through the only mechanism available to it. She picked up the doll. It was heavier than it had been the first time she'd handled it, in the sitting room, repositioning it away from Thomas's photograph. Not dramatically heavier. Perceptibly. The weight of something that had been accumulating for 6 weeks and was now concentrated in her hands. She carried it to the farm truck. She drove to Margaret Fenn's antique shop. She put it on the counter and looked at Margaret Fenn, who looked at her and at the doll, and had the expression of a woman who has been in the antique business long enough to recognize the look of someone returning something that has caused more trouble than anticipated. "I'd like to return this," Carol said. "I sold it to your mother." "I know. I'm returning it on her behalf. I'm not interested in a refund. I just need it out of my house." Margaret Fenn looked at the doll for a long moment. The doll sat on the counter and looked back at her with its painted, patient eyes. "I'm not sure I want it back," Margaret said. "Neither do I," Carol said. "But one of us has to take it, and I've had enough of it." Margaret took it back. She put it in the storeroom, on the bottom shelf, behind a box of old ledgers. She didn't put a price on it. She told herself she'd figure out what to do with it later. She never did figure it out. It stayed in the storeroom for 27 years. Margaret died in 1987, and the shop was sold and the contents were liquidated, and a dealer from Boston named Vincent Marsh came through and bought a mixed lot that included a cardboard box from the bottom of a storeroom shelf. But that's a story you already know. Part 9. After the summer of 1962 was the hardest summer the Voss family had. And the best. These were the same summer. Which is the nature of the thing that the Hollow cannot counterfeit. The way that real grief and real healing and real love are all made of the same material. Are all the same kind of hard. Are all conducted in the same register of vulnerability and cost. Harold and Edna talked about Thomas. Not all at once, not in a single cathartic conversation, but over weeks and months at the kitchen table, on the porch in the evening, in the small intervals of a working farm life where conversation exists between tasks rather than in dedicated spaces for it. Harold told Edna about Chosin. Not everything. Some of it he would carry to his grave, and that was his right, the right of a man who has seen things that language cannot adequately represent, but enough. The crack in the wall became, through use, a door. A door he could open and close deliberately instead of one the Hollow had been forcing. Edna stopped waking in the night. Not immediately. For 2 weeks after the doll left, she woke at the usual hour, 1-2 a.m. and felt the absence of it the way you feel the absence of a sound that has been constant for so long you'd stopped hearing it. The silence where the comfort used to be, the cold where the warmth had been. She told Carol about this. Carol sat with her through it on the bad nights, the two of them in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with tea, not talking about the doll but talking about Thomas, which was the same thing in the way that the healthy version of something and the corrupted version are made of the same materials. Edna's sleep normalized in August. She didn't mark the night it happened because she was asleep, which is the right way for sleep to normalize. Harold stopped dreaming about Chosin in September. He told Carol this at breakfast one morning, simply, flatly, the way he reported most things. And she looked at his face and saw something that had not been there in May. Not peace exactly, because Harold Voss was not a man designed for peace. Something more accurate than peace. Something that had always been there, but had been hidden behind the wall, and was now visible because the wall was finally the right height. Tall enough to protect, low enough to see over. Good, Carol said. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. Carol stayed through the fall. She had planned to leave in June, to go back to Burlington, and the practical project of figuring out what came next after the marriage. She stayed through the fall because the practical project could wait, and this one couldn't. She stayed because her parents needed her, and because she needed them, which was a thing she hadn't known she needed until she was in the middle of needing it. She left in November. She went to Burlington. She found an apartment and a job in the administration office of a hospital. Her first job in what would become a long career in hospital administration, and she called her parents every Sunday evening for the rest of their lives. Harold died in 1981, Edna in 1989. Carol was with both of them. She never told anyone about the doll, the way Paul Greer kept the box in the closet, the way Gerald Aldrich filed the journals in a university archive. She kept it the way her family had always kept things sealed, labeled, in the back of the appropriate mental drawer. But she thought about it. She thought about it for the rest of her life. About the 6 weeks in the Voss farmhouse in 1962. About the morning in the kitchen when her father finally said the thing he'd been carrying for 11 years. About the specific quality of the light in the room when he said it. About the way her mother's hand had felt in hers, gripping hard. She thought about what the hollow had tried to give them, the simulation of that morning, the manufactured version, the thing that looked like connection from the outside, and was entirely hollow in the center. And she thought about the difference being everything. The difference being the whole point. The difference being the thing you cannot feed to anything because it costs something to produce it, and the cost is what makes it real. In closing, a farmhouse in Vermont, a family that had been carrying something for 11 years and had a door open for them, the wrong door first, the right one after. Harold Voss carried his son for 11 years in a sealed box because it was the only architecture he knew. The hollow found the box, found the crack, used the crack the way it had always used cracks, as an entry point, as an access hatch, as the specific gap between what a person needs and what they've allowed themselves to have. What Carol Voss understood, at 26, that took some people decades to understand what Gerald Aldrich understood at 65, in a Connecticut study surrounded by his wife's antique collection. What Paul Greer understood at 16 in a drafty farmhouse with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, is that the hollow only has power in the gap. Close the gap. The real way. The costly way. The way that requires you to sit across from someone you love and say the true thing, the heavy thing, the sealed thing, the thing you've been filing and managing and walling off because you didn't know how else to carry it. Say it. To a real person. In a lit room. The hollow cannot compete with that. It has nothing that can compete with that. It can approximate everything about grief and love and loss except the cost. The cost is the thing. The cost is what makes it mean something. Harold Voss paid the cost at a kitchen table in Vermont in May 1962. 11 years late. Better late than the alternative. The alternative was the barn. At 2 in the morning. Pointing toward the place the box was buried. Being slowly consumed by something that knew his son's name and none of the things that made his son worth knowing. He chose the kitchen table. So did his wife. So did his daughter, who stayed through the fall when she could have left, who called every Sunday evening for the rest of their lives, who carried the summer of 1962 in the careful, private way of someone who has seen something they know they'll never adequately explain.
I'm Mr. Rippers. Episode 5 of Mournfield goes to the beginning, to 1947, to Elsa Vaughan and the Mournfield Circle, and the night 12 grieving parents asked something to come and something came. To the origin of the vessel, the first family, the first door opened, the first cost that nobody anticipated paying. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Elsa Vaughan opened the first one. Stay strange. Stay sharp. And the next time you're carrying something too heavy to carry alone, put it down, in front of someone real. That's the only thing that works. It has always been the only thing that works.